But for you on the French perspective, as you're coming out of Fort Duquesne, perhaps you were flanked by a native warrior or a Canadian milice that is coming along to raid this post in 1758. The main goal of the French was actually to relieve General Forbes of many of his horses and cattle, thinking that if they did that, they could actually slow him down, because they knew this force was massive and they would not be able to withstand him at the forks of the Ohio. Right there, that exact spot was so crucial because those three rivers came together and allowed you to control the entire Ohio River Valley. So again, as from the British perspective, perhaps there was a misfire, and then you begin to hear more of these shots being fired out, realizing that maybe this is a harassing party, and those grass guards are going to deal with them accordingly. And you can hear the wall gun being fired off too, utilizing some of the artillery to hopefully push this just harassment party away. And that swivel gun as well, being utilized as more of those French regulars now with this raiding force have now emerged from the hillside that is actually off to our left and right. Now the force that General Forbes had here was going to see a lot of different soldiers. Not only are you going to have Highlanders, the 60th Regiment, but you're also going to have provincials. So you're going to see Pennsylvanians, Virginians, Marylanders, making up this army that has been moving across Pennsylvania to get to Fort Duquesne. Also, you're starting to notice that you can hear the different noises of how this battle might have been, this raid. And you hear the different languages actually being cried out, the different commands, the different types of weapons. And those grass guards are now moving out, away from and back into the fort to utilize the protection of its walls. Seeing that again, this is not just a small harassment party of maybe a few, but instead is a more concentrated force. And seeing that advantage, the French have begun to push up into the fort to push the advantage, moving those grass guards off. And this is going to cause the British to have to react and move accordingly. And you can start to hear some of the drums playing, giving commands of moving these troops out to deal with this French threat. The regular forces moving down to counterattack, including those Highlanders, specifically of the 77th Regiment that was here during Forbes' campaign under Archibald Montgomery. Also the 60th Regiment. Now on October 12th, the battle never made it inside the fortification, but instead actually happened where many of the vehicles are at today across the Loyal Hannah. And it was a constant sending out of troops from the British side who were repulsed back into the fort, and then by utilizing the artillery, they were actually able to remove the French from the field. And as the regulars have come out and are exchanging volleys with the French, it has caused us to also bring out the provincials. Pennsylvanians, Virginians, and Marylanders, they're now forming a flanking force. Those provincial forces and those who would have been here on October 12th, like I mentioned with those Highlanders, Virginians, Marylanders, so on. The big name, General Forbes himself, who had orchestrated this entire campaign, was actually not here. Instead, he was incredibly ill and found himself at the back of the army quite often. His second in command, Colonel Henry Bouquet, was not here either. He was actually back along the road. And then that young Virginian officer, Colonel Washington, wasn't here either. He was actually sick during this time and again back along the road. It was Colonel Byrd who held down the fort on October 12, 1758.
Commence fire!
The French have begun to move back into a more defensible position, realizing that many of their flanks are now faced with their enemy. And they've begun to realizing that this is unattainable and that their goal was never to actually take the fort. They're removing themselves from the field back to this grassy area where they can reform, as many of those British cattle and horses have actually been driven off at this point. And those artillery pieces, that big 12-pounder opened up to push them back. As the French now are forming up outside the fort, those royal forces are going to follow along and push the advantage. As many of the provincials now begin to man the walls and again utilizing this fortification exactly as it would have been in this type of position. And at this point, the French have been pushed out, but now hopefully, by moving outside the fort, they'll be able to push them all the way back to Fort Duquesne. When General Forbes arrived here in early November, he had a few decisions that he was going to have to make. He realized that winter was on its way, and after this raid had occurred, believed that perhaps the French were stronger than he anticipated, and realized that he should stay here for the winter and renew the attack in the spring. And that is what he officially decided. But it was an incident that occurred directly after that. A friendly fire incident with a group of Virginians roughly 2 miles away from here and a young Colonel Washington that actually led to taking 3 French stragglers prisoner. When they did that, they brought them back to this post, questioned them, and found out that Fort Duquesne was incredibly weak. With that new information and with new intelligence and the fact that negotiations with Ohio Native tribes had gone well at Easton, With all of this information, General Forbes now reversed his decision and decided instead, in November, even with winter coming on, that they would move to attack Fort Duquesne immediately. But when this force arrived at Fort Duquesne, there would be no pitched battle, there would be no siege. Because the French, knowing that this army was on its way and knowing they would not be able to withstand the force that General Forbes had brought, they would actually light their powder magazine ablaze and headed back north, effectively leaving Fort Duquesne a smoldering ruin. And leaving the Three Rivers now in control of General Forbes. He would be carried into the Forks of the Ohio, and there he would claim that spot for king and country. The British would later then construct their Fort Pitt, which is how we get Pittsburgh today. But this would not mean that the war, as we know the French and Indian War, as over. Instead, it would mark a change. That the British now would be able to concentrate themselves not only on that, since they have taken Fort Duquesne, but now they would be able to concentrate on New France and effectively turn the tide of this war in their favor. Now, for those on the French perspective, you can see that those British regulars are beginning to fix their bayonets. For those on the British perspective, you'll be able to see the glint of those bayonets with the sun shining on them as they are then hoisted onto their shoulder. And the British will then lower those bayonets and move forward as a wall of spears. And those French troops firing a last volley and retiring. Moving quickly back to Fort Duquesne. So, ladies and gentlemen, the British forces have held the fort for all of you today. And let's give all these folks a round of applause. All of these folks have come from great distances to share this history with you and help us make us feel like we're a part of something that happened over 260 years ago, because it is still important because it happened right underneath our feet. From the British perspective, let's give our defenders a round of applause as they re-enter into the fort. So they're going to come down right in front of you here, folks. Line up, ground their firelocks, and listen to all these orders that they're being given. They're going through these movements just like a lot of these troops would when they would march in drill.